Friends, citizens, countrymen, fellow Virginians, fellow Williamsburgians, inhabitants of this continent, and now, dare I say, this country. Welcome to this conversation. My name is Thomas Jefferson. I have the happy honor of hosting this conversation over the next 45 minutes, and I would delight in seeking your curiosities as we delve ever deeper into the collective well of human knowledge. There has been, indeed, upon this soil, a great change of events. You likely have not heard, as these events have been taken place behind closed doors, but this day, July the 2nd of 1776, there was a vote. Now, I am going to relay to you some information that perhaps, as you do not know and were not part of the meeting, should not be yours to have, but I suppose that I can trust you. And therefore I feel, as friends and as fellow citizens, that I can tell you there was a vote for independence in the affirmative on this day, July 2 of 1776, which means we have indeed found ourselves in a new country, founded not upon blood right, not upon divine right, but rather upon a deeper right, mankind's right to choose the government that mankind would for himself. Our Creator gifted us with reason, and He expects us to use it. Our Creator did not tell us, for example, what form of government to take, which means our Creator gifted us with this life, the utilization of this reason, we sapient humans, and it is up to us, friends, to choose the best form of government that man might create that affects the greatest amount of security, safety, and happiness for our people. We have done that. We did so today, and will continue to do so as this union ever perfects. This day, July the 2nd, a dear friend of mine said, should be remembered ad infinitum with parades, fireworks, bonfires, grand illuminations, candles in every window. John Adams, a dear friend, sat on that committee of 5. Our job it was, formed on June 11th, to create a document, a declaration, should the vote go in this direction. And it has. You know, on that same day, June 11th of this year, 1776, there were 2 other committees created. One committee was to question what form of government might we take, look into ancient history, and begin proposing systems of government. A second committee was also formed to look into treaty. The third committee was the committee that I sat on with Franklin, Adams, Sherman, Livingston, myself, of course. That committee was to draft a Declaration of America's Independence, and that is now the work of the Continental Congress. Now, it should be said, friends, please do not spread this around. No one knows entirely of this issue. It is treason, you know. The punishment for treason is not kind. It is death eventually. First you are hung, and then you are cut down while still alive, and then your bowels are removed in front of you, and burnt in front of you while you're still alive, and then you're drawn and quartered, and the parts of you sent around to the various parts of the empire to serve as an example, and then your head is to be placed upon a pike. So I hope we win. Not just for me and my personal safety of this mortal corpus, but rather for all of us. We are gifting a promise to you. I hope this is understood. This radical nature of 1776 isn't that we declared independence. The radical, audacious nature of 1776 isn't that we took the crown off of one man's head. The radical nature of this year of 76 is that after taking the crown off of one man's head, we turned right around and are placing that crown on all men. What a radical, beautiful, audacious, stupid idea. We are giving the government over to you. Certainly, you will not harm it. And when I say all men, I mean all men, yes? Well, perhaps there is some discrepancy. And perhaps, friends, we should get into that discrepancy. I am certain that you have curiosities, and I wish to engage with your curiosities. Many of you, well, all of you, grew up as subjects. We are just now coming to understand what it means to be a citizen. We have no idea what this responsibility holds. Let us discover together. Let us understand the momentous movement that has brought us to this day of July 2 of 1776, and more importantly, let us present to each and the other this great hope that exists before us. For as man is inherently given the ability to create the government that we so choose, you can alter the government. In what ways might you do so? What rights might you extend to mankind that we could not fathom? This is your obligation, you kings, you freshly minted kings in this new republic taking its fledgling first steps. Huzzah! Don't tell anyone about this meeting. It's treason, and if we lose this thing, you know, I don't wish my name to be bandied about. I should turn the conversation over to my dear friend, Mr. Ziarko, who I believe has some questions amalgamated from folks around this country. Is this true, Mr. Ziarko?
Yes, we already have some questions coming in, but to begin, Mr. Jefferson, you mentioned just a moment ago that all men does mean all men, and yet I think there are some people who maybe see some inconsistencies with saying that, and even a man such as yourself who, if I'm not mistaken, does own other people as property. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Are you suggesting that I am human, Mr. Ziarko?
I only ask the question here. I make no suggestion.
Are you suggesting that being a part of we sapient beings, I might subject myself to the same system of flaws and yet equally the same greatness that every generation that has ever existed and every generation that might ever exist, being collectively in the body of mankind, might present themselves to?
I suppose so.
If men were angels, no government would be necessary.
Certainly, but not all men wrote this. You wrote this.
That's true.
I thought you might have some insight.
When I said all men in that document, the Declaration of America's Independence, which you have not had the opportunity to read, but no doubt you shall, my Declaration of Independence could have no doubt said all white men, and it would have passed. Assuredly. It could have said all white Protestant men, and it might have passed. Protestant Christians. It could have said all white men 21 years of age and older. When I said all men in our Declaration of America's Independence, I meant all men, and I shall point you back 6 years ago in 1770, and here's why. This is a pertinent point. In 1770, I tried a case back when I was senseless and I was an attorney. I have since given up the practice. I saw the light. When I was an attorney, there was a case, Howell v. Netherland, and Samuel Howell was my client. He was a third-generation mulatto slave. And in that case, presented at the High Court, the highest court in Virginia, Mr. Netherland was the slave owner. Samuel Howell, being a third-generation mulatto slave and was my client, we argued on prosecution on the hope that we could gain his freedom. We utilized, as per our argument, certain acts, slave acts of 1705 and 1723. 1705 Slave Act, of course, saying that the condition of the mother being the condition of the child, and that any child born of her body is now in lifelong servitude. The 1723 Act continues this, thus pushing even into a mulatto, that should a mulatto, that, as the Act states, abominable mixture of blood, are also bound in lifelong servitude, and any child born of her body, but it does not state specifically that a third-generation mulatto should be bound in lifelong servitude. And if you recall, I mentioned that Samuel Howell was a third-generation mulatto. In 1770, I promoted that case pro bono publica, and in 1770, in the promotion of that case, the trying of the case, I said, on the floor of the highest court in Virginia that all men are equal in 1770 on behalf of a mulatto slave. So when I wrote that all men are created equal in our Declaration of Independence, I mean it. Now here is the consternation. It is one thing to promote it, it's one thing to say it, it's one thing to promise it, and yet it is an entire another thing to deny it, to defer it, to keep some system of people subjugated, denying them rights. My Declaration of America's Independence is not a constitution. It does nothing to constrain and confine a people to a system of laws. It is merely a promise. And I promised with our Declaration of Independence that one of the foundational principles of this country is this idea of equality, and that we should continue to maintain and promote systems of equality upon this land. This is the promise. And if it is unfulfilled, then it is our job to fulfill it. It's your job to fulfill it. It's my job to fulfill it. So when I said all men, I meant it. I could have said all white men. I didn't. I said all men 6 years ago in 1770. with the case Howell v. Netherland. Just because it does not make its face known in our laws does not make it untrue. No doubt you have systems of philosophy in your time that exceed your system of law.
Thank you. Actually, as you were answering that, even Karen asked whether you thought of it as a factual reality that all men are created equal, or more of an intentional ideal that should be walked towards, that should ever be strived to.
Karen, this is a question of our age. A factual reality might mean indeed a physiological distinction or lack of distinction. Factual reality, science, is what I'm speaking of. Natural philosophy, we might find a distinction between the two species or races depending on which man of science you listen to. This might sound harsh for your ears to hear, but this is exactly the systems of thought that we are engaging with at this moment. Since I have been born in 1743, there are academies of science in Berlin, Academy of Science in Bordeaux, the Royal Academy in England, all have done dissections, sometimes literally, upon the physiology of humans. And the question that was put around the world by all three of those institutions is this: what is the cause of blackness? What is the cause? Are we physiologically the same? Are we physiologically different? Are we a different species? Are we a different race? Are we one people bound through monogenesis as one? These studies that have been done have been varied in their nature, including some studies that have placed a caustic agent on skin to increase boils and thus cutting away the boils. And the gentleman who did that study found a black agent within the skin of our African peoples. He called this agent Ethiops, Aethiops. Ethiops apparently have done by another study by a man in Berlin, whose name I believe is Meckel, and this man did a dissection upon the brain of Africans, saying that the African brain is blue, it is lighter in weight, and there is a pituitary gland inside that produces Ethiops and produces a degenerative quality upon the mind. This is literally, Karen, the cutting-edge science of our time. So when you ask what is factual versus what is promised, we must not just look to philosophic sophisms. We must look to the best science that we have. And right now, Karen, the best science that we have seems to suggest that we are a separate species. I write about this. I write about it in Notes on the State of Virginia, or perhaps someday I will. I'm a bit ahead of myself on that one. I apologize. In Notes on the State of Virginia, I shall dig into this topic and end with simply this. I hold it as a supposition only. Perhaps there is a distinction in the races, but isn't the beauty the distinction between us? It's one thing to promise something. It's another thing to find the facts. And you, Karen, are attempting to find the facts. So are we. This is why we must promote education and science. Yes?
Wonderful. One last, because we have questions in other areas, but since it's along those lines, Larry asks, have your views on slavery been changing? Are they still developing?
Well, Larry, I should tell you, I much like our society, find myself somewhat fluid. I grew up with slavery, as you know, as we all did. We all inherited slavery. Some of us quite literally inherited slaves. I inherited 65 or so slaves with the death of my father, 160 or so slaves with the death of my father-in-law. We all inherited slavery, and some of us inherited slaves. My thoughts on slavery have not changed for many years, and it is quite simply, I call the practice abhorrent. I call the men who forced it upon us wicked, and yet I continue to hold bipedal property. What a change. Quantum mutatus ab illo. How can these two things coexist? How can you, in one hand, Mr. Jefferson, say that all men are created equal, and yet in the other continue to hold the lash of slavery? This is hypocritical at best. At worst, well, my opinion on slavery is that it subjugates mankind. And if man in nature is born free and equal, then shouldn't we attempt to create a government that places that natural equality upon man? This is about rights. And believe me, this is a rights issue. We have been discussing this since 1765. It's not audacious to consider the rights of another human. What we are considering now is how to get out of this thing. I hope we can. I hope that I can.
Speaking of which, why haven't you freed your slaves?
Why haven't I freed my slaves? Well, first, we must legally change the nature of what they are. As you know, perhaps you do not, but as you might know, in Virginia, they are not considered humans, they are considered property. And as such, they are not given the same rights that humans, mankind, white men, white women are given. It is easy, you know, when science says these things, when science proves to us by the Academy of Science in Berlin and London, when science proves, perhaps factually, that these people are a different species, how easy does it become to dehumanize? And once dehumanized, it is even easier to present to them different systems of laws and rights. We would never give our horse the same rights that we give a human. And when science tells us that they are perhaps not human, then how easy it becomes. This is the problem with dehumanization. My people are my people. I never call them my slaves. I call them my family. I call them my people. And occasionally I call them servants. I inherited them. And you might also know I have a bit of a debt problem. Maybe you do not know that. Do not spread that one around either. I cannot, in my attempt to solve this equation of my personal finances, I cannot remove the bulk of my income, which are my people, and solve my debt. I do not know how to do it. I think the thesis is this. I'm attempting to get the state to do what I personally cannot. I have proposed systems of erosion of this institution of slavery with the Declaration of Independence, with a bill, Bill 51, and a batch of 126 bills, which erodes and makes illegal the slave trade. My Virginia Constitution, for example, presented from Philadelphia, sent, I believe, by Mr. George Wythe to Virginia, made slavery at large illegal in the year 1800. Generational slavery, illegal in the year 1800, and the promotion of slave trade illegal as well. All of these things must be presented to a body of men, all of whom own slaves. And then it must be debated by a body of men, all of whom own slaves, and voted by a body of men, all of whom own slaves. Do we see a problem? The problem is self-interest and status quo. And friends, once we solve self-interest, we will not just solve slavery, we will solve every single problem this nation will ever face.
We've gone very deep into that topic, so I want to steer us in a little bit of a different direction just for a moment, because I've had two questions. One from Joseph asking about your relationship with Dr. Franklin. We also had Alan ask about whether or not you got along with Mr. John Adams. I've heard some that say that he is obnoxious and unliked.
I thank you, Mr. Ziarka. Who are the names of these folks again?
Alan was asking about Mr. Adams.
We shall go with Alan first. Mr. Adams has been a dear friend of mine, of course, on that committee of five. We thought Mr. Adams might write this business. We thought Franklin should write it first. You know, when we were formed on June 11th, it wasn't that the committee was formed with one man chosen to write the Declaration. We were just simply formed, and then we were supposed to get the work done. And then we sat amongst our number around a table covered in broad green cloth, and we decided who should do it. We looked around at one and the other. Our eyes fell on Dr. Franklin. Franklin declined. He's not around. I'm going to tell you something else. You found me on a good day. Franklin leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, and said, "I will never again suffer my work to the scrutiny of a committee." I should have listened to him. As for Adams, we thought perhaps he should write the thing second. He declined, and then he said, "No, Jefferson, you should write it." And he gave me 3 reasons, and this is perhaps your point, Alan and Mr. Ziarko. 3 reasons, Mr. Adams said. I'm telling you this also in confidence. This was behind closed doors. I shall have no friends in confidence after this conversation ever again. Mr. Adams turned to me and he said, "No, Jefferson, you should write this, and I'll give you 3 reasons why. First, you are a Virginian, and a Virginian ought to be at the head of this business. Secondly," he said, "you're the finest pen we have." I offered no objection. Thirdly, he said, I kid you not, "I, John Adams, am obnoxious." I offered no objection to that one either. Nonetheless, I took his 3 reasons and I wrote the thing. I like them both. Dr. Franklin gave me a delightful story while my declaration was being emasculated by Congress at large, removing that anti-slavery clause. The story was about a hatter, John the Hatter. I won't get into it now unless you so desire, but it's Dr. Franklin at his best. And I believe he says he told me that story about John the Hatter, John Thompson the Hatter, sitting next to Thomas Jefferson while Jefferson writhed. They were destroying my document, but...
Is this a long story that Franklin went through?
I can make it somewhat short if you so desire.
I think it should be shared.
Franklin turned to me. This is in the middle of my document being torn apart by committee as a whole, which is their procedural obligation. He turned to me and he said, have you heard the story about John Thompson the Hatter? I said, nay. He said, John Thompson was a hatter. I guessed as much. And he was creating a new sign for his establishment. And he brought it to his friends. He was very proud of this thing. It was etched in wood, and it said, John Thompson, with a picture of a hat embossed on the thing, maker and seller of fine hats. And he brought it to his friends, and that was his first mistake. This road is paved with the most beautiful of intentions. And his friends said, well, Mr. Thompson, they do not need to know that you make the hats. They just are in the market for a hat. It's redundant. You should etch it out. So he took it away, etched out. John Thompson, seller of fine hats, with a hat embossed. He took it back to his friends. His friends, again, looking at the sign, and John Thompson looking at them, expectantly excited to hang the thing upon this new storefront. And his friends looked at him and said, well, John Thompson, they already know that you sell the hats. There are hats in the window. There's a hat on your sign. It doesn't matter. That's, again, redundant. Very good. John Thompson walked away, etched away, seller of fine hats. Now it just says John Thompson with a picture of a hat. Finally, thinking the thing was done in this very small work of a committee, he brought it back to his friends, assured that this would be the final product, his final draft of his declaration. He presented it to them, and one of his friends turned to him and said, John, they don't care what your name is. This was Dr. Franklin's consolation to me while they were destroying, emasculating my Declaration of Independence. That's the story.
I thank you, Mr. Jefferson. Rebecca wants to know, what are your thoughts on inoculation? Inoculation,
it's good. Rebecca, do it. If you have not done, I understand there is some fear upon the subject. Why on earth would you inoculate yourself with some virulatic nature and create a sickness upon yourself? But I tell you, friends, our Creator has gifted us with the greatness of our bodies, and we might, for example, through the smallpox, which is a great danger in our time. Look to the milkmaids, Rebecca. Look to the milkmaids. You know, cowpox. Cowpox is a less virulent version, as we understand, and milkmaids not being somewhat immune, I suppose, because they have contracted cowpox, a relation of the smallpox, and thus we find that these pustules which carry this disease might be scraped away from the diseased and placed in lacerations on your arm or perhaps your thigh, and then you infect yourself with a lesser degree of the disease, and wouldn't you know it, Rebecca, we survived. I have survived. I've been inoculated. I was inoculated in 62, I believe, in Philadelphia. You're laid up for quite some time, you know, Rebecca. Several weeks it takes for your body to fight off the illness, but once you have done it, you never again find the sickness. There have been riots, Rebecca, around this idea of inoculation. Do not believe it. Trust in science. It's good for you.
We have another question here. This is going back to some of those more difficult. Carla's asking if you thought all men were created equal. Why did you ignore women? She seems to posit that women weren't given rights.
Carla?
Carla, yes.
I thank you, Carla. Carla, when I say man in the document, the Declaration of Independence, it is generally understood. If you read philosophy of my time and before my time and philosophers and statesmen of my time, when we say man, we are talking of the collective body of mankind, which would necessarily, absolutely include the fairer sex, your sex, the female. If I said that all men are created equal in my Declaration of Independence, and then I went home to my wife, well, I wouldn't be sitting here today. When we say all men, we mean mankind, generally. Read Locke, read Montesquieu, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, read Descartes, René Descartes, for these ideas of mankind. We generally include the women as well. I thank you, and I understand your concern. Now, the right of suffrage, the right of vote, do not press me so hard.
There's also been a question from Ken. In the document, he believes, I think he might have an early copy, so there might already be some of them out there. This isn't just on you, because he mentions in the 4th paragraph, there's a phrase, merciless Indian savages. Can you elaborate on that phrase, and do you want to perhaps share with who may be credited with that? Is that yours, or was that from committee?
As I recall, Merciless Indian Savage was in the document that came out of our subcommittee or committee of 5 and into the committee as a whole that had just been dissolved out of Congress into a committee of the whole. As I said, our merciless Indian savages have been forced upon us. This is a common known system of warfare on this continent, has been used for decades and decades and decades, and this is to utilize a people who have no interest in our particular wars against one and the other. It should also be said, Ken, that we have done the same. We have employed their number for our cause, and I guarantee you we will look to them to further secure this thing through future bloodshed. Their system of warfare is somewhat merciless, as I understand it. We sit in fine lines and fire at one and the other. We are very orderly, and we understand how a gentleman should and could fight. Their systems of combat are quite different, and perhaps to an English eye, an English ear, and an Englishman's understanding of tactics, quite savage indeed. This phrase might speak harshly to your ears, but to our ears we understand the tactics that we have and that we utilize versus the tactics that they utilize. I thank you for your question, Ken. It is an apt and right question. The document's not perfect, you know. I don't know if you know this, but a human wrote it. I say that man cannot create a government that's better than mankind itself. So I apologize for my discrepancies therein, but nonetheless, it is the best that I could do. I stole most of it.
I have 2 questions here that might be a very short or very long answer, depending on the person involved. Both Izzy and Tina want to know what your feelings are towards and what it's like working with Alexander Hamilton.
Who?
Alexander Hamilton.
What's his name?
Alexander Hamilton.
No doubt there are a million things he has not done, as I have never heard of him.
I only asking the questions as they put it forward.
No idea, friends. We shall be introduced someday, no doubt, and we shall have a glorious and lovely friendship that shall not be impeded upon by policy, platform, or politics. Hypothetically, we will have a beautiful, brilliant relationship opening up like the spring tulips. For the rest of our lives, there shall never be a difference between this. What's his name?
Alexander Hamilton.
Huh?
Alexander Hamilton?
That.
Thank you. Next, Andrew would like to know, can you elaborate on your views of God and Christianity? Some of your statements, he says, that apparently he's heard from you before seem contradictory, whether or not America is a Christian nation, and just what are the beliefs of some of your peers upon this?
My goodness, Andrew, you wish me to divulge to you something quite so domestic and close to my heart. You know, I say it this way, Andrew. I never ask another man his religion, and I ask that no man inquire into my own. But as we are friends, as I can tell through this delightful mutual confab that I can trust you, I shall tell you frankly. I was born and raised in the Church of England, Andrew, as were we all, by law. attending that church unless you paid your year's fine up front every year, Mr. With. Nonetheless, we have some understanding of Christianity that has been passed to us. Now, here is perhaps the most salient point, Andrew. I do not believe it to be beneficial to mankind at large for a government to dictate a man's ecclesiastical pathway. It is not the object of government to tell you what you should practice, or should not practice. It is not the government's object to interject itself in the conversation between you and your Creator, Andrew. That is a sole and private conversation between you and your Creator, or creators, or lack of a Creator. It does not matter to me. It should not matter to your government. In fact, I say it this way, Andrew. Whether my neighbor believes in one God or 20, it neither steals money from my pocket nor breaks my leg. It is simply an opinion. And yet, sure as the sun will rise tomorrow, Andrew, there will be one person on this globe killing another because of a difference of opinion. Let us do something new. Let us disentangle this web between church and state with roots generations long, beginning in 1493, Andrew. 1493, these roots grow so deep when Chief Justice Prousseau's translation was mistranslated by Mr. Finch. He said that our current laws, civil authority, should give credence to Holy Scripture, and that's not what Chief Justice Prousseau wrote. Nonetheless, here we find ourselves. I wish to disentangle church and state. Andrew, whatever your religion is, you should be able to practice. That's my belief. Now, I have studied many Bibles, many religions, and my particular ecclesiastical understanding towards a creator or creators is mine own, and I shall not get into that.
Audrey says, "Hello, Mr. Jefferson," and she asks, could you tell us more about your family?
My family, Audrey? Well, I thank you for it. My wife and I married in 1772. We wanted to marry in 71, but her child by her first marriage passed away, and so we had a year of annus lectus. We had a year of mourning. So we said, that's fine, we'll push the wedding off until sometime in 1772, and so on January 1 of 1772, we married. We could not stay apart. We have since had our first child was born in 73, 1 year later, September, as I recall. Just 9 months and a few days after getting married on January 1. When my wife discovered that she was with child, we had the conversation that we all have. You know, if it is a boy, what should we name him? I said Peter, after my father. And she said, yes, but what if it is a girl? And I said, well, I haven't thought of that. And I said, we should name her Martha after you. And she said, no, Virginia has too many Marthas. And I said, fine, then we'll name her after my sister, Martha. So the next year in September, the three of us, Martha, and Thomas, celebrated our first Christmas. Nonetheless, childbirth is not easy on my wife, but I hope that's not entirely too much domestic private information, but we're ever growing, our family. My father, Jane Randolph, born in London. My mother, Peter Jefferson, born in Virginia. Peter Jefferson was a surveyor, a planter, an explorer, a man of the House of Burgesses for a brief period of time, a sheriff, a cartographer. He was my mentor, and when he passed away when I was 14, I say that he left me in the snow, no footsteps before me to guide my path, no torch to lead me, and my mother passed away just a few months shy of watching her son tear down the entire country that she knew this year, in 76. Sometimes I wonder what my father would think. What would he think of his son, the traitor, tearing it all down? I don't know.
Thank you. Lindsay was wondering, can you ride a horse?
Can I ride a horse? Well, yes, of course. I am a Virginian. We're known for drinking, riding, and litigation.
As simple as that?
Well, sure, yes. Come to Virginia, Lindsay.
Wonderful.
Must be a Marylander.
Probably. Frank is asking about what your favorite travel is like and what your favorite tavern is. Now, I don't know if that's
travel
your favorite tavern you've ever been to, or maybe recently.
Well, I quite enjoy, there are some 14 taverns, you know, in Williamsburg, and I enjoy them all, but when I stay in this city, I stay at the The Red Brick Tavern and the Market Square Tavern generally. I have family in this city. I'm related to the Randolphs, which means I'm related to half of Virginia, and that means I also equally have some beds in Williamsburg as well. When I'm in Philadelphia, this year of '76, I have just moved away from one of my relatives' homes, Benjamin Randolph, or as I write in my books, Randall, but it's Randolph. And I moved out, all the way outside of the city of Philadelphia, on the corner of 7th and Market Street, entirely outside the city, as I write, for more elbow room. And I'm staying at Jacob Graff's place. Do you know Jacob Graff? Jacob Graff Jr., he's a bricklayer, and he owns a place there. I rented the second floor of his flat. So that's where I'm staying currently. Hiltzimer, he's the man who has the stables across the street, and he's readying my horses. Speaking of horses, here's one for the last question from the Marylander, Lindsay. I have a new horse just born of the Fear Not line. Fear Not. Do you know that line, Fear Not? Fearnaught. They're very prized in Virginia. I paid a great deal of money for this bloodline, and I shall name him Caractacus.
All right, wonderful. But now we have one I think that's going to be a little bit longer answer, because Andrew wants to know, Mr. Jefferson, is it more important to you being a Virginian or becoming an American?
Well, that is fascinating, Andrew. You gave me pause there, because we have nothing truly that unites us as one people. There are no articles that unite us at this moment. There is no centralized federal form of overreaching government that unites us as a people. The only uniter we have, Andrew, is a common enemy. But sometimes a common enemy is the greatest uniter that man has ever had. The strange thing, and your question is correct, what happens if we win this thing? What happens if that enemy is removed? Will we then see ourselves as Virginians and Marylanders and New Yorkers and New Jerseyans and tear ourselves asunder? You know, Newton speaks of this. This is centripetal versus centrifugal force, is it not? Should there be then, Andrew, as you seem astute of government mind, should there be then some centralized force that binds us together as our understanding of the celestial spheres bound together? Else we spin ourselves apart as different states fighting amongst one and the other with this enemy removed. This is a fascinating question. I don't know what you're proposing, but it is perhaps the right question. I should say this. At this moment, it is best to be united. But I can tell you honestly, Andrew, I'm a Virginian, and Virginia has my heart, this great, beautiful commonwealth. When I talk sometimes of my country, or my countrymen, I'm talking about Virginia. And at other times, when I say those exact same things, I'm talking about Americans. Virginia has my heart.
Wonderful. Matt wants to know, how will you rank this declaration among great human documents? Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights of 1689. There are some great documents that we look to in history. Do you see this as part of those documents?
Oh, I know not. You know, I say it was not my job to write new words which had never before been writ, or put into ink thoughts which had never before been thought. My job was simply to capture the current spirit of mankind and to put it into terms so clear and so plain as to command man's assent. When viewed in that way, it is not my document. It never was my document. It is our document. If my intent was to capture the current spirit of mankind, then whose document is it? It's mankind's document. It is yours. It always has been. How shall it rank? I will tell you this. I am writing. I spend one day a week writing almost the entire day. I'm writing at this week, in this moment, in 1776. I'm writing not about the document. I'm writing about the movement away from England. For me, I believe I'm correct in understanding myself that the document is not nearly as large of an impact on my personal life, or perhaps a life post this moment, not near as large as the fact that we are separating. That is the large portion of this movement forward. Now, I will say, I hope that this document is perhaps look to as a touchstone. I placed in it phrases that we might look to should we ever need them to find some clarity. No, it's not my document, never was.
Donna has an interesting question. She wants to know, do you feel Independence Day is July 2nd or July 4th?
Thank you, Donna. Independence Day is July the 2nd.
Simple as that.
Well, yes. Why would we consider it the 4th?
I don't know. Donna asked the question.
You know, Donna, I see your question. Your question is this: is it more important to celebrate the day that we voted on independence, or to celebrate the day that everyone knew about independence? I don't know. You choose.
All right, and I think we have time for just one last question, but I think it's a wonderful one as it looks to the future. Larry wants to know, what do you see the results of the Declaration of Independence? What do you think they will be?
The results of the Declaration of Independence?
Yes.
Well, certainly it's called the Declaration of Independence, but let's not mince words. It is the declaration of war. There is some legal understanding as to whether or not we even needed to declare war. Perhaps the king has already declared war. I understand this argument very well. The hope is that this document will be read aloud, will be read to our people, and not just our people, but printed around the world. My hope, and I write this rather, my hope is that this document will be to some immediately, to others eventually, and finally to all around the world. So what do we mean by that? Well, let's look at some of the most resonant phraseology within that document. That all men are created equal. Well, you know, Larry, as well as I do, that there are systems of government around this world that do not hold that idea as a part of an ingrained and sanctified principle within their government. My hope is that this document, thus being read round the world, might be adopted round the world. The philosophy within this document, the ideas. Ideas are meant to be spread. There's no such thing as plagiarism, for example. How sad would that be? To read Descartes, to read Montesquieu, to read John Locke and say, oh, what a beautiful idea. I should never say those words because that's plagiarism, or utilize them in simple government form. We would not have give me liberty or give me death. We would not have sanctified rights of life, liberty, pursuing happiness. We would not have these ideas of separation of church and state. Ideas are meant to be spread. So I hope that this document is spread. That would be my hope.
I think we've come to the end. I think there's one last very short question that I'll put for you. Teresa would like to know how you're going to celebrate your Independence Day.
How am I going to celebrate my Independence Day, Teresa? I shall tell you, and this is in my memorandum books, I brought with me a pipe of Madeira wine that was casked in 1776 years ago. I brought it with me, and I'm going to broach it tonight. Do you wish to join me? 7th and Market Street in Philadelphia. I shall be there. Knock on the door thrice, kick it with your foot once, and then coo like a bird. Perhaps a rooster, not a crow. I can't abhor crows, but and then we shall perhaps broach that pipe of Madeira together. I like Madeira. I like wine. I like good, fine French food, and I like to dance. And now that I have done a great deal of industry here in Philadelphia, spilling a bit of ink, engaging in treason, for which the punishment is death, I believe perhaps a nice glass of wine is in order. Yes? Is that it?
That's it.
Very good. Friends, thank you for joining me. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for having this brave, enlightened, heightened conversation. Where on earth are we more free to have enlightened conversation than on this soil? It does not matter the flag that flies above your head or the soil that's beneath your feet. Never forget that your right to your mind and your freedom of expression of that mind is a right inherent to all men, regardless of the nation that you call home. If you find yourself in times of uncertainty, if you find yourself with times of needing clarity, then perhaps you should come here. Come to Williamsburg, beyond our walls. Come here and we shall have heightened, enlightened conversation, and we can talk of all the things that you're not supposed to speak of during Thanksgiving dinner. Until we meet again, I am ever your humble and most obedient servant. Thomas Jefferson.